My son stood up in a room full of family and told everyone I was broke. Said it loud enough that nobody could pretend they hadn't heard it. Said it like a fact, like a diagnosis, like something the whole family had already agreed on behind my back. Every head in that conference room turned toward me at once. Nobody defended me. Not one person. And then the lawyer opened the last envelope on the table and read my name first. I want you to sit with that image for a second, because I did. I sat with it for a long time before anything else happened. My name is Daniel Whitfield. Everybody calls me Dan. I'm 64 years old. I run a small precision machine shop off Sweeten Creek Road in Asheville, North Carolina, the kind of place that makes parts nobody ever sees, gears and fittings for equipment that other people rely on without ever thinking about who built them. I spent most of my life believing that if you did the quiet work, the right work, eventually somebody would notice. I was wrong about that, or at least I was wrong about when. This is the story of the moment I found out how wrong, and the one moment right after that I will remember for the rest of my life. Let me back up. My father was Walter Whitfield. Everybody in Weaverville knew him. He ran Sheldon Ridge Orchard off Riems Creek Road for almost 50 years, 42 acres of Honeycrisp and Stamen apples on the north side of the ridge, a little brick farmhouse he built with his own hands in 1961, and a name in that town that meant something. He was not a wealthy man in the way people mean it on television. He was wealthy in the way that mattered more, the kind of wealthy where 3 generations of a family could still sit down at the same table. In the spring of 2019, my father started forgetting things. Small things at first. Where he'd parked his truck at the Ingalls on Marymount Avenue. What day trash pickup was. Then bigger things. He forgot my mother had passed in 2015, and for about 4 minutes one Tuesday afternoon, he asked me where she was, and I had to tell him again, and I had to watch his face fall apart again, like it was the first time. The doctor at Mission Hospital called it vascular dementia. Mild at first, then not mild. My father was 85 years old that spring, and the man who taught me how to graft an apple tree at 7 years old was starting to disappear one piece at a time. I want to be clear about something, because people ask me this. I did not resent taking care of him. Not for one single day. What I resented, later, was what other people assumed about why I looked the way I looked while I was doing it. Here's what nobody in my family knew for almost 4 years. My father's Social Security and his small orchard pension covered about 60% of what full-time in-home care actually cost. I know that number because I sat with a calculator at my kitchen table more nights than I can count. The other 40% came from me, quietly, without a single announcement. In the fall of 2021, I sold our family's lake cabin on Lake James, the one my late wife Linda and I bought back in 1998, the one where my kids learned to fish off the dock. Sold it for $211,000 to a couple from Charlotte who wanted a weekend place. I didn't tell my son Bryce until after the closing. I didn't tell anyone until after the closing. That money went straight into a home health account that paid for a rotating team of aides, and eventually, for one aide in particular who stayed longer than anyone expected. Her name was Ruth Callahan. I'll come back to Ruth, because she matters more to this story than almost anyone else in it. By the winter of 2022, I'd also downsized out of the house Linda and I raised our kids in over on Kenilworth Road, moved into something half the size, and traded in a truck that was only 3 years old for a 2012 Ford F-150 with 240,000 miles on it that I bought outright for $6,000. No payment, no interest, nothing that could come back to bite me if the money got tight again. And it did get tight again, more than once. From the outside, if you weren't paying close attention, if you were the kind of person who measured a man by his truck and his house, and whether he canceled a cruise to Alaska 2 Christmases in a row, which I did, you might start to draw a conclusion about me. You might start telling people that conclusion at Thanksgiving dinner like it was fact. That's exactly what my son did. I just didn't know it yet. Bryce is 34. He's my oldest, sharp as anything, went to Appalachian State on a partial scholarship, moved to Charlotte after graduation, and got into commercial real estate. Big talker. Always has been, even as a kid, even back when he'd tell his little sister Emily that the moon followed their car on purpose because he liked how her face looked when she believed him. I used to think that was charm. I think differently about it now. My daughter Emily is 31. She's a physical therapist at a clinic on Marymount, and unlike her brother, she showed up. Every Sunday for 4 years, she drove out to Weaverville, sat with our father, did his stretches with him, brought him the little chocolate-covered orange slices he liked from the fresh market. She never once asked me how I was affording any of it. She just noticed I looked tired, and she'd bring me a coffee too. I didn't know, in those years, that my son had started forming his own theory about me. I found that out later, piece by piece, the way you find out most things that matter, which is usually too late to stop them. The first crack showed up on a Sunday in March of last year. Emily called me from the parking lot of the Ingalls, her voice tight in a way I hadn't heard from her before. "Dad," she said, "did you know Bryce has been going up to see Grandpa on Wednesdays?" I said no, I didn't, and I remember feeling something small and cold settle in my stomach, because Bryce lives an hour and 40 minutes away in Charlotte, and Wednesday is a work day, and my son does not, as a rule, drive an hour and 40 minutes on a work day unless there's something in it for him. I didn't say anything to Bryce about it. Not yet. I told myself I was being unfair. I told myself a son visiting his grandfather is a good thing, not a suspicious thing, and any father who thinks otherwise has a problem, not the son. I want you to remember that I told myself that, because it's going to matter later. I found out what those Wednesday visits actually were about 7 months later, and by then it was already almost too late to do anything about it. My father called Howard Pruitt, his attorney of almost 30 years, on the evening of November 3rd. I know the exact date because Howard wrote it down, time-stamped it, and put it in a file, because that's the kind of lawyer Howard Pruitt is. My father told Howard that his grandson Bryce had come by that afternoon with paperwork, a power of attorney amendment. My father, even in his condition, even on a day when Ruth told me later he'd struggled to remember what year it was, still had enough of himself left in the room to know that something about that visit felt wrong. He told Howard that Bryce had explained it to him twice, patient and smiling, telling him it was just a formality, just something to make things easier if his health declined further, something about giving Bryce authority to handle the orchard situation if a buyer came along. My father did not sign it. He told Howard he wanted to talk to me first. He told Howard he wanted the whole thing written down, exactly what happened, exactly what was asked of him, and exactly what he said in response. Howard drove out to Weaverville himself 2 days later and had my father sign a notarized memorandum describing the visit in his own words, while he was still lucid enough to do it properly. That document sat in a file at Pruitt and Vance Law on Patton Avenue for 4 months before I ever knew it existed. I didn't know any of that yet. Not that November. What I knew that November was that my father was getting weaker, that Ruth was staying later and later some nights without asking to be paid overtime, and that my machine shop had just come out of the worst 2 years in its history after a flood took out half our equipment in 2021, and it took me the better part of 3 years to climb back out of that hole. I want to be honest with you. There were months during that stretch where I genuinely wondered if I was going to lose everything I'd built. I never told my kids that. I never told anyone but Emily, and even then, only once, at 2 in the morning, sitting in her kitchen after a bad night with Dad. That's the year my son started telling people I was broke. I didn't know it yet, but the story was already spreading before my father ever passed away. My father died in his sleep on the morning of March 14th, at home, in the bed he'd shared with my mother for 53 years. Ruth found him. She called me before she called the funeral home, before she called anyone else, because in 4 years of working in that house, she'd become something closer to family than an employee, and she knew, the way you know things without anyone teaching you, that I needed to be the one to hear it first. I drove out to Riems Creek Road that morning going faster than I should have, past the orchard rows just starting to bud, and I sat with my father's body for almost 20 minutes before I let myself call anyone else. I want to tell you, I said something profound in that room. I didn't. I just held his hand, the same hand that taught me how to graft a tree, and I said thank you 3 or 4 times, quiet, like a man talking to himself. The funeral was at Weaverville First Baptist, the church my father had attended for 60 years. Standing room only. Half the town showed up, because that's who my father was to Weaverville. Bryce gave a eulogy. I remember it was polished. Smooth. He talked about legacy and hard work and the Whitfield name. And it was a good speech, the kind of speech a man gives when he's good with words, which my son has always been. I sat in the front pew between Emily and Ruth, who I'd invited to sit with family, and I noticed, though I didn't think much of it at the time, that Bryce never once looked at me while he was speaking. I didn't know it yet, but that eulogy was the last kind thing my son was going to say about me for a long time. 3 weeks later, On a Tuesday morning in April, we all gathered at Howard Pruitt's office on Patton Avenue for the reading of the will. Me, Bryce, Emily, my sister Carol and her husband Mitch, and Ruth Callahan, who had been formally invited by letter, which I noticed made Carol's eyebrows go up the second Ruth walked in and sat down. The conference room had a long cherry table and a view of the mountains through a window that needed cleaning. Howard sat at the head with a folder in front of him, thick, the kind of thick that tells you there's more in a will than just a list of who gets the china. Before Howard even opened the folder, Bryce stood up. I want you to picture this room. Everyone's still settling into their chairs, coffee cups just poured, and my son stands up at the head of the table like he's about to run a business meeting instead of sit through his grandfather's will. I think, he said, before we start, there's something the family needs to talk about honestly. And he looked directly at me when he said it, which told me exactly where this was going before he said another word. Dad, he said, and his voice had that smooth, reasonable tone he uses in negotiations, the one I'd heard him use on the phone with clients 100 times. We all love you. But I think everyone in this room needs to be honest about where things actually stand. You sold the lake house. You're driving a 15-year-old truck. You downsized twice in 3 years. Emily and I have talked about this, and I think, for Grandpa's sake, for the sake of what he built, the estate needs to go somewhere that's actually going to be managed responsibly. I sat very still. I want to be honest with you, because people ask me this too. In that first moment, I wasn't even angry. I was confused. The specific kind of confused you feel when someone describes you using words that don't fit any version of yourself you recognize. Emily's face went white. I remember that clearly. She said, Bryce, we never talked about this. I never agreed to this. And he waved his hand at her the way you wave away a fly, and kept going. I'm not trying to be cruel, he said. I'm trying to be practical. Dad's had money trouble for years now. Everybody's seen it. I think the responsible thing, the thing Grandpa would have wanted, is for the orchard and the investment accounts to be placed under someone who's actually in a stable financial position. Someone who can make sure none of it gets lost to back taxes or bad decisions. Somebody's chair creaked. Nobody spoke. My sister Carol looked down at the table. Her husband Mitch studied the ceiling like it had suddenly become fascinating. Ruth Callahan, sitting 2 seats down from me, had gone very quiet and very still, her hands folded in her lap. I looked around that room, at people I had known my entire life, at family who had eaten dinner at my table more times than I could count, and not one of them said a single word in my defense. Not one. That's the moment I want you to remember, because it's the moment everything in this story turns on. My son stood in a room and called me a financial liability in front of the people I love most, and the silence that followed was louder than anything he'd said. Howard Pruitt cleared his throat. Bryce, he said, mild as anything, are you finished? Bryce sat back down like a man who'd made his case and was satisfied with it. I'm just saying what everyone's thinking, he said. Howard looked at me. I want you to know, Dan, he said, that you don't have to respond to that right now if you don't want to. And I didn't. I sat there with my hands folded on that cherry table, and I let the silence sit exactly where my son had left it. If you've been with us for a while, you already know how these stories tend to go. But stay with me here, because this one has a turn coming that even I didn't see fully until the moment it happened. Welcome to Sweet Family Revenge Stories. If this story is already getting under your skin, that's exactly where we want it. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Hit that like button, and stay with me, because what happened in the next 20 minutes in that conference room is the reason I'm telling you this story at all. Howard opened the folder. He read through the standard portions first, calm and methodical, the way lawyers do. The house and its contents. A modest life insurance policy. Some personal items, my father's pocket watch to Carol, his fishing gear to Bryce, a box of old photographs, and my mother's wedding ring to Emily. Bryce shifted in his seat through all of it, restless, like a man waiting for the part of the meeting that actually mattered to him. Then Howard pulled out a second envelope. Cream-colored, sealed with actual wax, the kind of thing you don't see much anymore. My father's handwriting across the front. To my family, to be read aloud at the reading of my will. Howard looked up before he opened it. I want everyone to know, he said, that your father dictated this letter to me on December the 9th of last year, and reviewed and signed it himself on December the 16th. He was of sound mind on both occasions. I have documentation of both, including a cognitive assessment from his physician dated within that same window, if anyone in this room wishes to see it. He looked directly at Bryce when he said that last part. I noticed it. I don't think Bryce did, not yet. Howard broke the seal and began to read. My father's letter started plainly. It always did. He wasn't a man for flowery language. He wrote the way he talked, direct, unhurried, a little dry. He wrote that he wanted this letter read after the standard bequests, because he wanted everyone to hear the small things first, the pocket watch and the fishing gear and the photographs, before they heard what came next, so that nobody could say later they hadn't been paying attention. Then he wrote this. I'm going to tell you what I know, because I think it's time somebody in this family said it out loud. He wrote that in October of 2021, Ruth Callahan had mentioned to him, in passing, that she was worried about Mr. Dan working himself too thin, driving an old truck, skipping his own doctor's appointments to save money. My father, sharper on some days than others, but never a fool, asked her directly what she meant. Ruth told him the truth, because Ruth doesn't know how to do anything else. She told him that I had sold the lake cabin, that I downsized my house, that I'd been quietly covering the gap in his care for years without ever once mentioning it to him or to anyone in the family, because I didn't want him to feel like a burden, and I didn't want anyone else in the family to feel obligated to help carry something I'd already decided was mine to carry. My father wrote that he confirmed it himself over the following months, going through statements with Howard's help, adding it up the way you'd add up a column of figures on a ledger, because that was still a thing his mind could do even when other things had started slipping away from him. He wrote the number down in his letter. $143,000, across just under 4 years, not counting time, not counting the birthdays and the trips and the version of retirement I might have had instead. I sat in that conference room and heard my own life read back to me in my father's voice, coming out of another man's mouth, and I did not move. I did not trust myself to move. Then Howard turned the page, and the letter changed direction. My father wrote about November 3rd. He wrote about Bryce's visit, the paperwork, the power of attorney amendment presented to him on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon while I was at work and had no idea it was happening. He wrote that he remembered, even on a bad day, that something about the way his grandson explained it twice, slowly, like he was talking to someone who might not remember being asked, felt less like patience and more like pressure. He wrote that he had refused to sign, that he had called Howard that same evening, and that Howard had come out 2 days later to document everything while it was still fresh, while my father could still say clearly, on the record, exactly what had been asked of him and exactly why he'd said no. Bryce's face had gone very still by this point. I watched it happen, the confidence draining out of him the way water drains out of a tub, slow at first, then all at once. My father's letter continued. He wrote that in the months after that visit, he had asked Howard to look further into it, quietly, because he wanted to understand why his grandson, a man doing well by every outward appearance, would need him to sign anything at all. Howard, with my father's written authorization, had pulled some public filings, some court records, the kind of paper trail that follows commercial real estate deals when they go badly. 2 failed developments outside Charlotte. A lawsuit from an investor group. Personal guarantees Bryce had signed on both deals, the kind that don't disappear in bankruptcy, the kind that follow a man home. Howard read the number out loud, because my father had written it plainly, without cruelty, just fact laid next to fact. Approximately $410,000 in personal debt, as of the previous autumn, some of it already in collections. I want you to sit with that for a second, because I had to. My son had stood up in that room 20 minutes earlier and called me financially irresponsible, called me a man who couldn't be trusted with an estate, while carrying nearly $500,000 of his own debt that not one person in that family had known about, least of all me. I didn't say anything. I want to be honest with you about that too, because people ask me why I stayed so quiet through all of this, and the truth is, my father had already said everything that needed saying. I didn't need to add to it. Some things are stronger left exactly the way they were written. Howard read the final section of the letter. My father wrote that he was placing the orchard, the investment accounts, and the remainder of the estate into a trust, with me named as sole trustee, effective immediately upon his death. He wrote that the orchard was not to be sold, not for 10 years at minimum, not to any developer, not for any reason short of my own death or incapacity, because he had watched what that land meant to this family for 50 years, and he wasn't going to let it become a line item on somebody's balance sheet to cover a bad debt. He wrote that Emily would receive an equal share of trust income alongside me. In recognition, his words, not mine, of 4 years of Sundays that nobody ever asked her to give and that she gave anyway. He wrote that Ruth Callahan would receive $75,000 outright, along with a standing invitation to remain in the small guest cottage behind the farmhouse for as long as she wanted it, rent-free, because in his words, family isn't only the people who share your blood, it's the people who show up on the Wednesdays nobody's watching. I looked over at Ruth when Howard read that part. She had both hands pressed over her mouth, and she was crying the way people cry when they've spent years assuming nobody noticed them, and then find out somebody noticed everything. And then, last, my father wrote about Bryce. He wrote it gently. I want you to understand that, because it would have been easy for my father to write something cutting, something designed to wound, and he didn't do that. He wrote that he loved his grandson, that he believed, underneath the version of Bryce that had shown up at his house that November afternoon, there was still the boy who used to help him carry apple crates up from the lower orchard every October, the boy who cried the day their old dog Scout died and wouldn't let anyone else bury him. He wrote that Bryce would receive $25,000 outright, no strings, and the standing offer of a position managing seasonal logistics at the orchard, should he ever want it, at a fair wage, doing honest work, starting exactly where any new employee would start, not as an inheritance, as a chance. He wrote one more line after that, and Howard read it slowly, like even he understood the weight of it. My father wrote, I'm not punishing you, Bryce. I'm just done pretending that money fixes a man. It never fixed me. I don't expect it'll fix you either. But work might. Howard set the letter down on the table. Nobody spoke for what felt like a very long time. Bryce was the one who finally broke it. His voice, when it came out, wasn't smooth anymore. That's how much, he said, and stopped. That's it. $25,000. He looked at me, and for a second I saw something in his face that looked almost like the boy carrying apple crates. Dad, he said, did you know about this? Any of this? No, I said. I found out the same way you did. Carol finally spoke up from across the table, quiet, ashamed. Dan, she said, I didn't know. About the cabin, about any of it. You should have told us. I looked at my sister for a moment before I answered. I didn't want anyone carrying what wasn't theirs to carry, I said. That was my choice to make, and I made it. I'm not looking for credit for it now. I turned to my son. I want to be clear with you, Bryce, I said, and my voice stayed level, the same way it had stayed level for the entire reading. I'm not going to pretend I'm not hurt by what you said in this room today. I sat here and let you call me broke in front of people I love, knowing you were carrying $400,000 of debt you never told a single one of us about. That's not something I can pretend didn't happen. He didn't argue. I think, more than anything, that surprised me. The old Bryce, the one who talked his way through every negotiation of his life, had nothing to say. But I also said this, because I meant it, and I still mean it. Your grandfather left that door open for you. $25,000 and a job at the orchard, starting at the bottom like anybody else would. I'm not going to close that door just because I'm angry today. That's his wish, not mine to override. And honestly, even if it were mine to decide, I think I'd leave it open anyway. Bryce looked down at the table for a long moment. When he looked back up, his eyes were wet, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, he looked young again, the way he'd looked the day we buried Scout in the backyard when he was 9 years old. I don't know if I deserve that, he said quietly. Probably not yet, I said. That's kind of the point of a second chance. I want to pause here and tell you about the part of that afternoon that didn't happen in the conference room, because it's the part that actually mattered most to me. After the reading ended, after Carol and Mitch left quietly, after Bryce sat alone in the parking lot for almost 20 minutes before finally driving away, I walked outside and found Ruth Callahan standing by her car, still holding a tissue, looking out at the mountains the same way my father used to look at them from his porch every evening at 6 o'clock, like he was checking on them. I walked over and stood beside her. Ruth, I said, I don't think you understand what you did for that man. For years. Nobody made you stay that long. Nobody made you drive him to VFW meetings on your day off, or sit with him through the nights he couldn't remember where he was. She wiped her eyes and said, he was easy to love, Dan. Even on the hard days. Especially on the hard days, honestly. I told her about the cottage, about the $75,000, and I watched her face do something I don't think I'll ever forget, a kind of disbelief that slowly turned into something quieter and steadier. The look of a woman who has spent her whole working life being the person nobody thanks, finally hearing that somebody had been paying attention the entire time. She told me later, over coffee about a month after all of this, that the money was going to pay off her mother's medical debt from a hip surgery 2 years back. Debt Ruth had been carrying quietly herself, the same way I'd been carrying mine, neither of us ever mentioning it to the other, both of us just doing what needed doing without waiting for anyone to notice. I think that's part of why my father trusted her so completely near the end. She never asked for anything. People like that, the quiet ones, the ones who just show up, they're rare. My father knew it. I know it too now, more than I used to. Emily and I drove back to Weaverville together that afternoon, the long way, past the orchard, past rows of trees, just starting to leaf out for the season. She was quiet for a long time before she finally said, "Dad, why didn't you ever tell me how bad things got? The cabin, all of it?" "Because you were already giving up your Sundays," I told her. "I wasn't going to ask you to give up your peace of mind, too." She reached over and put her hand on my arm, the same way she used to when she was small and scared of thunderstorms. "That's not fair," she said. "You don't get to decide what I can handle." I laughed, actually laughed, for the first time in what felt like weeks. "You're right," I said. "I'll try to do better." 6 months have passed since that morning in Howard Pruitt's office. I want to tell you honestly how things stand now, because I think you've earned the real ending, not a tidy one. Bryce started working at the orchard in June. Not as an owner, not as an executive, just as a hand, learning the harvest schedule, learning how to read a tree the way his grandfather taught me to read 140 years ago. It hasn't been easy. There have been weeks he didn't show up, weeks he did. One long conversation on the porch in August where he finally told me the truth about the 2 failed developments, about the guarantees he'd signed thinking he could always cover them later, about how easy it had become to blame me for looking poor instead of admitting he actually was. "I'm not going to tell you we're fully repaired. I don't think that happens in 6 months. I think it happens in years, if it happens at all, and I've made peace with not knowing yet which kind of story this turns out to be. What I do know is this. Emily comes out to the orchard most Sundays still, out of habit now more than obligation, and some Sundays Bryce is there too, and they work the lower rows together the way they used to as kids, and I stand on the porch where my father used to stand every evening at 6 o'clock, and I watch them, and something in my chest settles that hadn't settled in a very long time. Ruth still lives in the cottage. She still comes up to the main house some evenings, and we sit on that same porch, and she tells me stories about my father I never knew, small ones, the kind that don't matter to anyone except the people who loved him, and somehow those are the ones that matter most. I think about that morning in the conference room sometimes, the silence after my son called me broke, the way not one person in that room stood up for me. I used to think that silence was the worst part of the whole story. I don't think that anymore. I think the worst part would have been if I'd let that silence convince me of something that wasn't true. It didn't. My father made sure of that, from beyond every ordinary reach a man is supposed to have. There's a version of this story where I stood up in that room and defended myself, loud and immediate, the second my son opened his mouth. I didn't do that, and I don't regret it. Some things don't need defending in the moment. They just need time, and the right person to finally say them out loud. My father was that person for me, one last time, the same way he'd been that person my whole life, even from a letter written in December, even after he was gone. If there's one thing I'd want you to take from this, it's this. The people who talk the loudest about what you don't deserve are often the ones who have the most to hide about what they actually owe. And the people who never ask for anything, who just keep showing up, quiet and steady, year after year, those are usually the ones who deserve to be believed first. My father knew that. It took a conference room on Patton Avenue and a letter sealed in wax for the rest of us to catch up. I still drive that same 2012 Ford truck, by the way. 260,000 miles on it now. I could afford something newer these days. I just haven't seen the need. Some things you hold on to not because you have to, but because they remind you exactly who you were when nobody was watching, and exactly who was watching anyway. If this story meant something to you, take a second and hit that like button, drop a comment, and tell me where you're listening from. And subscribe if you want more stories like this one. Share it with someone who's ever been the quiet one in their own family, the one nobody thought to thank. I'll see you in the next one.